Highland offerings on YouTube. A bit about our presenter today. Marie Pellissier is a fifth-year PhD candidate at William and Mary. Her dissertation focuses on food and memory at Colonial Williamsburg. She is a public historian and digital humanist and holds a BA in history from Boston College and an MA in public history from Loyola University, Chicago. Today's conversation will concern how cookbooks are primary sources, a unique way for us to situate ourselves within a community history. I encourage you to ask your own questions today in the Q&A box at the bottom of our webinar screen. We will try to answer as many as possible following Marie's presentation today. So without further ado, Marie, I turn the screen over to you.
Thank you so much, Maria. Thank you everybody for coming. It's lovely to be here with you all today. I'm going to share my screen here and get us going. Lovely PowerPoint screen. Okay. So as Maria said, my name is Marie Pellissier. I am a fifth-year PhD candidate in the history department at William and Mary, and I'm so excited to be here at Highland for this virtual presentation, and then for the pop-up exhibit later this afternoon. I hope many of you are going to be able to join us for that. So we're going to talk today about using cookbooks as primary sources, as things that can tell us about the past, right? And particularly about everyday life in the past. This is something I've been doing for nearly 10 years, first in my research as an undergraduate student at Boston College, and then in my research as a graduate student, first at Loyola University, Chicago, and then here as a PhD candidate at William and Mary. In my opinion, cookbooks are one of the most valuable sources for scholars to learn about everyday life in the past, especially the lives of people who didn't necessarily make it into other forms of written records, people who weren't necessarily showing up in government records, for instance, or writing memoirs or leaving diaries. Often we can find evidence about them in cookbooks, and often those people are women. So cookbooks are a really fantastic way to get a glimpse into women's history, the history of women of color, women who weren't necessarily high up on the social scale, right? These are all people who are often missing from our records, and we can see them in cookbooks. So today we're going to focus on cookbooks as transmitters of different forms of knowledge. My expertise is primarily in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries. So that's where most of my focus is going to be, but we will talk about some 20th century and more modern cookbooks as well. We're going to talk about these as ways of passing on knowledge. We're going to talk about knowledge about food. We're going to talk about knowledge of literacy. We're going to talk about knowledge in terms of identity and social dynamics, including gender, race, and class. And for each of these different forms of knowledge, I'm going to highlight a different cookbook from the past. I'll talk about the elements of the text that helped me come to my conclusions, and how exactly I, as a historian, use these cookbooks to learn about the past. But first, we're going to start with a brief overview of the history of cookbooks in the United States. We're going to calling it Cookbook History 101, and then I'll launch into those different case studies. So, what exactly is a cookbook? It seems like a fairly self-explanatory thing, but if you think about it, cookbooks or recipe collections, to use a broader term, go back a really long time. The oldest cookbook that we have actually comes from ancient Mesopotamia. It's almost 4,000 years old, and it's a set of cuneiform tablets that come from ancient Mesopotamia with a bunch of recipes for stews that were intended for the table of royalty. We've got cookbooks from ancient Rome. A man named Apicius wrote De Rerum Coquinaria, or in English, The Art of Cooking, and manuscripts from the medieval Islamic world, one entitled Kitab al-Tabhi, or the Book of Dishes. So people have been writing down recipes for a really, really long time. And while a cuneiform tablet may not look very much like the sort of glossy cookbooks by celebrity chefs that we see on the shelves at Barnes and Noble, this idea that knowledge about food is important to write down and pass on has been with us for a very, very long time. The earliest cookbook in English is called The Form of Curry. So in Old English, the form of curry, it sort of translates to the form of cooking. And so if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, that picture of a manuscript, that's the form of curry. It dates to the 1390s and is from the court cooks at the court of King Richard II. And so for the rest of this discussion, as much as I would love to go down and talk about cookbooks from all over the world, that's just like, I don't have that much time. And so we're going to be focusing on cookbooks in English, primarily from the United States, but some of the cookbooks I'll be talking about will be from Great Britain as well. So what do all of these early cookbooks have in common? One thing that they have in common is that they were all written for the elite, right? We've got the cuneiform tablets for the cooks for the king. We've got King Richard II's court cooks writing things down. Even the Arabic cookbooks are for the elites, right? For the nobility, for royalty. Literacy, as well as fine food, was the domain of the upper echelons of society for most of human history, right? Most people did not know how to read and write. Literacy as a sort of broad spread accomplishment is something that pretty much everybody knows how to do, is a very modern idea. And so cookbooks were the domain of a very small set of people until the 18th century. In the 16th and 17th centuries, noble and gentry women in England kept manuscript recipe collections, and we'll see a couple of those later in this talk. And in the 17th century in England, we also start to see the publication of printed cookbooks, books like Gervase Markham's The English Housewife, which was published in 1615, and Hannah Woolley's book, The Queen-like Closet, which comes out in 1670. These books promise to reveal the secrets of fine cookery to the nobles and gentry who wish to keep up with their betters. So the Queen-like Closet, for instance, closet here refers to a sort of private space, almost like an office. So in the Queen-like Closet, Hannah Woolley is promising her readers that she's going to tell them the secrets of the Queen's kitchen, right? She's going to tell them the secrets of what the Queen eats on a regular basis. And so you have these sort of books of secrets that are aimed at the gentry who want to eat as much like royalty as they can. These receipts, the recipes in this book, so you're going to hear me use recipe and receipt as an interchangeable term. Receipts in these books covered a wide variety of foods. They also covered home remedies, which fell under the purview of gentry women in the 17th and 18th century, as well as household tips and tricks like formulas for polishes and paints, ways to keep your nice leather gloves looking soft and supple. And so you'll see that these recipe collections, these very early ones, are aimed at a pretty high level of society. Over the course of the 18th century, however, a couple of things are changing socially, especially in England, and these changes kind of trickle down to the American colonies. You're starting to see more and more young women move from the countryside into urban areas in search of service jobs as cooks, as sort of general maids of all work. And you're starting to see an expansion of literacy, right? An expansion in the number of people who are able to read. And so to respond to that, you see cookbooks increasingly aimed at first middle-class women, right? Women who maybe haven't had a servant before, but are learning how to manage a household. And then by the end of the 18th century, you actually have books that are aimed at the servants themselves. So as literacy spreads and becomes more common, as more and more young women are taking domestic service jobs, cookbooks start to serve a different function. Instead of being a sort of keeping up with the Royal Joneses, as it were, they become a sort of manual for how to be a good servant, right? How to be a good housewife. Oops, I did not mean to do that. How to be a good housewife in the middle class. And so this up at the top image here is from the Complete Housewife. This is, I think, the 13th edition or 15th edition of this book. I don't quite remember. Or Accomplished Gentlewoman's Companion. So this book, it was published in London. It's aimed at a gentry woman. And you can see from the illustration, right, what the sort of expectation for the reader is. This woman in the center who's standing there with her hand on her hip is in charge of the kitchen. She is the complete housewife, but she needs to know all of the information in this book in order to be able to direct the servants who you can see working in the kitchen around her. And so by the end of the 18th century, texts like Amelia Simmons' American Cookery, which is the first cookbook authored by an American author, are targeted specifically at lower class women, at women like the servants in this image, who are entering domestic service for the first time and offer advice not just on how to cook, but also on how to go to the market in a city, what you should be looking for to make sure you're not getting cheated, how to find fresh food, as well as tips and tricks for household maintenance. Oops. So by the early 19th century, cookbook publication is proliferating greatly in the United States. Cookbooks continue to offer both recipes and household hints. And in the period before the Civil War, they're increasingly reflecting growing regional and partisan identities. So in 1824, Mary Randolph, a Virginia woman, publishes The Virginia Housewife, which is the first explicitly Southern cookbook. That is, it's the first cookbook to claim Southern origins in its title and to offer recipes for foodways that we would now recognize as being Southern food. Lydia Maria Child's 1828 cookbook, The Frugal Housewife, was published in Boston and dedicated to those who are, quote, not ashamed of economy. And that's a very distinctively New England cookbook, right? It's got New England regional foods, things with cranberries, Indian bread called cornbread also uses very distinctive New England phrasing. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term down cellar, but my father's from Western Massachusetts. And that's always the way he referred to like going down into the basement. And so these books are plain, right? So if you look at the first two images over to the left on this slide, these are images from, well, the first image is Mary Randolph's The Virginia Housewife. It's a very plain book, right? No pictures, no colors, very simple and straightforward. And Mary Randolph is, like most cookbook authors, assuming that her readers or their servant or enslaved cook already has a basic knowledge of the processes involved in cooking, as well as a keen sense of taste. Mary Randolph, for instance, recommends in a recipe for raspberry cream, she says, quote, stir as much raspberry marmalade into a quart of cream as will be sufficient to give a rich flavor to the fruit, strain it and fill your glasses, leaving out a part to whip into froth for the top, end quote. So she's assuming you know what you want your raspberry cream to taste like. She's assuming you know how much you're going to put in order to make it taste right. And she's also assuming that you know what she means by whipping it into a froth for the top, right? There's a lot of assumptions about what the reader already knows in these early 19th century cookbooks. Well, we're going to talk a lot more about that in a little while. By the latter half of the 19th century, however, after the Civil War, cookbooks are increasingly providing their readers with standardized instructions. The home economics movement, which began in the late 19th century and coincided with the increasing number of women who attended institutions of higher education, sought to represent cooking as not this sort of mysterious art that women learned from their grandmothers, but as something that could be standardized, right? They wanted to make it a science in order to justify studying it at a high academic level. So they're trying to replace recipe descriptions that say things like, take a piece of butter the size of an egg. Okay, what kind of egg? How big of an egg? Are we talking about a chicken egg? Are we talking about, I don't know, an ostrich egg? Like how much butter are we actually talking about here? So they're trying to, in the home economics movement, standardize. Instead of saying take a piece of butter the size of the egg, they're going to say something like take 4 tablespoons of butter. But then you have to figure out, well, what is a tablespoon? How are we going to standardize a tablespoon? The Boston Cooking School cookbook by a woman named Fanny Farmer was one of the first cookbooks to provide precise measurements, standardized measurements, as well as descriptions of techniques. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, industrialization had taken hold in the food industry. And so it's not only easier to encourage people to use standardized measurements because we're getting used to standardized measurements in lots of other things, not just in cooking, right? We're getting used to standardized measurements of time and distance and all kinds of other things, as well as, we start to see in the late 19th century, corporations publishing their own cookbooks in order to teach people how to use new products. So baking powder, for instance, is patented in 1856, and almost immediately you see baking powder companies publishing little pamphlets to try and teach people how to use their new product. The orange cover here is from a World War II book from Knox Gelatin. So the gelatin company wanted to offer people options that both used gelatin, but also allowed them to work within their rationing. And so in the early part of the 20th century, you see both corporations and the government responding to the First and Second World Wars by publishing cookbooks to help housewives cope with and deal with the new rationing requirements that put limits on everything from flour to sugar to meat and dairy. The post-war era saw consumption and consequently cookbook production boom in a new way as authors targeted new audiences. And so you start to see cookbooks for suburban dads who want to learn how to grill. You start to see cookbooks like Julia Child's Mastering the Art of French Cooking, and this sort of new movement of American gourmands, right? People interested in gourmet foods starting to pop up. So Julia Child publishes Mastering the Art of French Cooking in 1963. And if you go to Barnes and Noble today, you can sort of see the legacy of Mastering the Art of French Cooking on the shelves in all of the different kinds of cookbooks that represent cuisines from around the world. It's really in the second half of the 20th century that Americans become interested in cooking global cuisine at home. And so the modern cookbook, as we think of it, right, sort of lots of glossy photos, maybe a celebrity chef. I brought one along to share at the pop-up exhibit that's Paul Hollywood from the Great British Baking Show. I have his bread book, and it's a lot of pictures of like grumpy gorilla Paul Hollywood, also some really lovely breads. So this type of cookbook with those glossy photos and the emphasis on the celebrity as much as on the food, those really come into being in the 1990s. This is a very brief overview of the history of cookbooks in the United States. I obviously didn't have time to cover every possible type of cookbook, but if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and I'll be happy to answer them when we get to the end of the webinar. So cookbooks as transmitters of knowledge, that's really the thing I want to emphasize today, is that we can learn so much as historians, as scholars, as people who are interested in the past. We can learn so much from these books because of the knowledge that they contain, and they contain lots of different kinds of knowledge. This knowledge has mostly, but not always, been passed between women. You do see men involved in cookbooks even from the earliest days. Arguably, those really ancient cookbooks were authored by men to begin with, and then they become women's domain. And now you could argue that cookbooks are sort of, some cookbooks, right, are a little bit less targeted at women and sort of targeted at everybody. But as historical sources, cookbooks show us how multiple forms of knowledge are shared and taught over time. The most obvious form of knowledge here is food knowledge, right? What are we eating? How do we cook the thing that we're eating? How do we serve the thing that we're eating? When should we be eating this particular thing? Other forms of knowledge we can see in cookbooks include embodied knowledge. So embodied knowledge, I'm using this term to describe the knowledge that is embedded in your physical body, right? So another way to describe this might be muscle memory. Think about a pianist, right, who memorizes a piece for a performance and sits down and doesn't need to look at it to know where her fingers are supposed to be on the keyboard. That same kind of muscle memory is there if you're an experienced baker and you're making a batch of cookies and you say, oh, I know exactly what this dough is supposed to feel like, right? Or if you know what it's supposed to taste like. Or if you're cooking something on the stove and you know what it's supposed to smell like before you add the next ingredient. That's embodied knowledge, that sort of understanding based on your senses that's hard to explain in a text. Embodied knowledge and food knowledge go hand in hand in cookbooks. And we'll talk about how the transition to standardized recipes was an attempt to help people who didn't necessarily have that embodied knowledge still understand how to cook. Another type of knowledge we'll talk about is literacy, the ability to read and write. Cookbooks hold evidence of women passing on that skill between themselves and using cookbooks as spaces to practice their literacy skills. Cookbooks also give us insight into women's social circles and communities, how they passed on culture, and how they used food to create and maintain a sense of history and identity for themselves. So we're going to start with food knowledge and embodied knowledge. As I mentioned before, most recipes and cookbooks before the turn of the 20th century kind of assumed that their reader had a fairly significant amount of know-how. One early 18th century manuscript cookbook, this one's from the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. It belonged to a woman named Margaret Turner around 1709. And it provides some really fantastic examples of what this looks like in recipe form, this sort of, oh, well, I assume you know what you're doing. So this is a recipe for what's called a Pope's posset. A posset is a sort of medicinal drink. The best comparison I can think of is a sort of warm smoothie. They don't sound very good to me, but they were very popular in the 17th and 18th centuries. And so for her posset, she writes, blanch and beat 3/4 pound of almonds so fine that they will spread between your fingers like butter. Put in water as you beat them to keep them from oiling. Then take a pint of sack or sherry, sweeten it very well with sugar, make it boiling hot, and at the same time, put half a pint of water to your almonds and make them boil. Then take both off the fire and mix them very well together with a spoon. So she's assuming that you know how to do a lot of things already without her having to tell you, right? She assumes that you know how to blanch the almonds. She assumes that you know how long to beat them, and what exactly does she mean spread between your fingers like butter? Well, I think you're aiming for a sort of very smooth paste, but the best comparison she can come up with here is like butter. What exactly does that mean? She assumes, are you supposed to put them in warm water? Are you supposed to put them in cool water? What kind of basin should you be putting them in? Are you putting them in a jug? Are you putting them in a bowl? When you're boiling the wine, do you know how to keep your fire going? Do you know what kind of vessel you're supposed to be using? So as we think about it, right, there's so many layers of things that the author is assuming we already know in order to make this posset and make it work. All of this is food knowledge, sure. It's the knowledge of how to do the thing, how to cook the recipe. But it's also embodied knowledge, right? Knowledge that you've acquired, you as the cook, presumably have acquired over long years of practice. Now, the same manuscript cookbook sometimes shows us that sometimes embodied knowledge needed support. So another recipe in the Margaret Turner Jr. cookbook, this one is for cheese, demonstrates how women tested and experimented in the kitchen. Oops, there we go. Demonstrated how women tested and experimented in the kitchen to supplement the knowledge passed down to them by their teachers, by their mothers, their grandmothers, their female relatives, friends. The author walks us through the steps of making cheese. I'm not going to outline them all here, but she starts with boiling whole milk with rennet, which is a piece of the stomach of an unweaned calf, which has certain coagulating properties. Then you squeeze and press the curds into the cheese molds, and then you press them even more to get all the liquid out, and then you wrap them up and store them so that they can age. Now, she writes in this recipe, quote, I used to salt it in the curd, and then it was very troublesome to come together again, that it would sometimes fall all to pieces. It is very troublesome to turn. Now it will crack in these places where the wild curd lies, that they must be very careful in the turning of it. And when it is well pressed, you must pin it up very straight with a cloth. And so what the author is telling us here is that she couldn't rely on her own embodied knowledge. She was running into problems. And so she wrote down what those problems were, and she wrote down what her solution was. So her problem was that she was putting the cheese into the mold, she was pressing it, and she found that it would fall to pieces even after she had pressed it. So you would expect your cheese to sort of stay together. Think of like a big wheel of Parmesan, right? That's kind of what we're going for here. You would expect your cheese to stay together. She's finding that it's falling apart. And her solution is that you wrap it really tightly with a cloth before you set it on the shelf. And you have to be really careful in the process of turning it. So this is something you do as a cheese is aging. You're flipping it over so that it's aging appropriately on both sides. And so she's noting all of this information down so that she can use it again. And so that though anybody who's using her book in the future will know the problems she ran into, and not necessarily have to rely on their embodied knowledge to solve cracking cheese. So, okay. So cookbooks also provided space for women to pass on the skills of literacy to their children and friends. Literacy includes reading and writing, but those two skills were not always taught together in the 17th and 18th centuries. Most people learned to read before they learned to write, if they learned to write at all. And the skill of using a quill pen, if you've ever tried to use a quill pen, it makes a giant mess if you don't know what you're doing. And so like embodied knowledge, using a quill pen is a form of embodied knowledge. It's a muscle memory that takes practice, just like using a pen or a pencil does. And so in this cookbook, which is attributed to a woman named Elizabeth Capel, this one is actually in special collections at Boston College. It's dated to 1699. And in this cookbook, you can see spaces where someone, and I'm not entirely sure who, but someone was practicing their reading and writing. You can see, and I've just made this bigger for you all, the title of recipe number 167, to fry lamb or rabbits, is written in a larger and I think shakier handwriting than the recipes around it. If you look at the handwriting above and below it, it's very practiced, right? It's tight, it's clear. The title, though, is wobbly. It looks like somebody is practicing. And I argue that this is exactly that, right? This is somebody learning to write by practicing writing the title of a recipe. This isn't the only manuscript cookbook where we see this. There's actually a manuscript cookbook associated with Martha Washington that contains evidence of young women practicing and doodling and practicing their handwriting in blank pages of the book, and sometimes over the recipes. So those two young women were named Frances and Lucy Parks, and Frances and Lucy Parks were Martha Washington's first mother-in-law and aunt-in-law, I guess, respectively. So if you look on the right-hand side of this page, you can see Lucy Parks has written her name multiple times as she's practicing. For women in the 18th century, particularly gentry women like Frances and Lucy Parks, they learned household skills alongside literacy skills. And so it makes sense that they'd be practicing their handwriting in a cookbook like this, because those two skills were so closely entwined. We can also learn a lot from cookbooks about how women utilize their social networks to disassemble and also to test and verify knowledge over time, and also how they use them to generate support and raise funds for social causes. So in the 17th and 18th centuries, manuscript cookbooks like the Capel manuscript, which is to the far left here, often have attributions. They have notes about who gave those recipes to be included in the text. So the Elizabeth Capel manuscript, for instance, drew on many other women, including Mrs. Retchison, Lady Tryon, Mrs. Monk, Mrs. Wiltham, Lady Hardup, and Mrs. Knightsbridge, as well as men, Mr. Stovenord, Dr. Bowles, Dr. Thurby. All of these people contributed receipts to this book. The Margaret Turner cookbook, which we talked about a little bit earlier, cites her aunt and her mother, as well as other family friends, as recipe donors. And so from these attributions, we can get a sense of a woman's social circle. We can also get a sense of who she trusted to provide recipes, right? It's all well and good to say, oh, you know, my Aunt Sarah gave me this recipe, but actually Aunt Sarah's a terrible cook. You know, it doesn't necessarily, you can see who women trusted to give them reliable recipes based on the attributions in these cookbooks. Now, I have my own, this practice carries on, right? I have my own recipe collection, which again, I've brought to share at the pop-up exhibit this afternoon, with things I've learned from my grandmother, things I've learned from my father, my mother, my friends. We still do this. This is a practice that has carried on into the present day and will allow future historians to map our social circles and map how we acquired our knowledge, which I just think is really cool. Another type of cookbook that gives us a chance to do this is the community cookbook. So if you've ever bought a cookbook from a church fundraiser, the cookbook in the middle here, 300 Years of Black Cooking in St. Mary's County, Maryland, might look awfully familiar, right? That sort of spiral binding. And so these kinds of cookbooks are often used for fundraisers. And in these books, attributions serve a slightly different purpose. Recipes from well-known people, whether they're well-known on a local scale or on a national scale, help sell the cookbook and advance the fundraiser or the cause for which the cookbook was assembled. So the Women's Suffrage Cookbook over on the far right was published in 1890 as a fundraiser for the cause of women's suffrage, and it included recipes attributed to many nationally famous women who were active in the women's suffrage movement. Women like Julia Ward Howe, you might also know her as the author of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, Frances Willard, who was president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, Elizabeth Stanton, and Lucy Stone. Other community cookbooks with a more local reach show us who was who in a community. and who might have been considered an expert in certain areas of food. 300 Years of Black Cooking in St. Mary's County, Maryland, for instance, was first published in 1975, and it's got a great example of this. 4 of the 7 recipes for beverages, most of which are sort of teas or other kind of restorative drinks for people who might be sick, come from a woman named Teresa Young of Leonardstown, which tells me that she was pretty well known for these sorts of things within her community. From attributions of recipes in older and in more modern cookbooks, we can map out a community and begin to understand how knowledge passed from one person to another. Some cookbooks are also snapshots into the gender, race, and class dynamics of the past. What Mrs. Fisher Knows About Old Southern Cooking was published in 1881 in San Francisco, California. The author, Mrs. Abby Fisher, was a formerly enslaved African-American woman. She had won medals at the State Fair in Sacramento and at San Francisco's Mechanics Institute Fair for her jellies and preserves, and ran a successful business selling these jellies and preserves. So this is the second cookbook published by an African-American woman in the United States, and it includes a bunch of recipes for very explicitly Southern dishes, which is interesting because it's published in California. We can talk more about that later. So she includes things like Maryland beaten biscuits, a recipe for what she calls plantation cornbread, Sally Lunn bread, and lots of other things that we might immediately identify as being Southern food. Now, Abby Fisher was born enslaved in South Carolina before the Civil War. Her husband was born enslaved in Alabama. And in the preface and apology at the beginning of the text, which is here on the right, Abby Fisher says that she can't read or write. So if she can't read or write, and neither can her husband, how did we end up with a cookbook by Abby Fisher? If you look at the bottom of the page under preface and apology, you'll see a list of names. And these are names of citizens of San Francisco who were involved in the publication, who sponsored the publication of Mrs. Fisher's book. And some of them were likely involved in taking dictation from Abby Fisher, in turning the knowledge that she had in her head, in her hands, into words on the page. This makes this a really interesting book because we don't know a whole lot about the people involved in the production of the book. We don't necessarily know, at least I don't necessarily know, whether they were Black or white citizens of San Francisco. And we also don't know what changes they might have made. We don't know if the recipes that are appearing in this book are exactly as Mrs. Fisher knew them in her head. We don't know what parts of her voice might have gotten lost in the process of transcription and publication because she was not literate. And so there's a lot to unpack here. This is research that I haven't done yet, but would love to do, or it's there for the next for another culinary historian to dive into. But books like this also give us this fantastic glimpse into gender, race, and class dynamics. And the last form of knowledge I'd like to highlight today is historical knowledge of a community's identity. Cookbooks from particular religious or ethnic groups, for instance, preserved and passed on the recipes that the community perceived as best representing their identity, recipes that they wanted to hold on to in order to preserve their community history. These are particularly prevalent among immigrant groups in the 20th century as immigration to the United States explodes and immigrant communities are negotiating how to assimilate and fit in with the broader population in the United States, but also retain their own identity, right? Retain their memory of where they came from, and also adapt it. So I'm thinking of recipe collections, for instance, from Jewish communities or from Greek Orthodox communities that represent traditional foods from those communities that they don't want to lose, while also contributing through fundraisers, right? Through being sold as part of a fundraiser to the community's well-being, right? And continued existence within the broader sort of milieu of American society. These kinds of cookbooks weren't always from immigrant or religious communities, however. Recipe books were also a space where museums and historic sites can put forward their version of heritage, history, and identity for the visitors who stop to browse in their gift shops. One really fascinating example of this is the 1938 souvenir cookbook, The Williamsburg Art of Cookery, written by a woman named Helen Bullock, who was a research historian at Colonial Williamsburg in the 1930s. Now, this is very early in the history of Colonial Williamsburg. The museum is only incorporated in 1926 and doesn't actually open to the public until 1932. And so this book comes out at the very, very beginnings, right? This is 6 years after CW opens to the public. So this is very early on in the museum's interpretation. Bullock's book looked and felt like a colonial book. And I have a copy of this that, again, I'll be sharing at the pop-up exhibit this afternoon. So if you're able to come by and see it, it's really interesting to see just how hard they worked to make it look and feel like an 18th century book. It's using the same kind of type. It's printed on the same kind of paper. It has very similar illustrations. But the recipes inside are not colonial. They're like the furthest possible thing from colonial. They're actually this kind of funky mix of recipes from the 18th century, yes, but also from the 19th and 20th centuries, including some rather jarring anachronisms. When you pick up a book that looks like it's from the 18th century, I know when I first looked at this, I was not expecting to see Robert E. Lee cake in this book that was supposed to be representing 18th century Virginia. We all know, right? Robert E. Lee, not part of the 18th century milieu, right? Famous for his participation in the Civil War and leading the armies of the South in rebellion against the federal government. Robert E. Lee cake itself actually dates to the later part of the 19th century. It doesn't actually have, as far as I know, any affiliations with Robert E. Lee himself. This is a recipe that starts popping up in the decades after the Civil War as people across the South are grappling with how to memorialize the war and starting to create and perpetuate the lost cause narrative, right? The narrative that this was a noble endeavor and that the South, the whole South will rise again and all of that. So why is Robert E. Lee cake in this cookbook that's supposed to be presenting the 18th century to you? Well, it's because Helen Bullock and Colonial Williamsburg at this point, and it's important to know, like, this is the 1930s, Colonial Williamsburg in the present is not doing this anymore. In the 1930s, Colonial Williamsburg was presenting a version of the past where they, I would argue, conflated the colonial period, the 18th century, with the antebellum era, with the 19th century before the Civil War. And that vision of the past emphasized hierarchy and stability, and this idea that everyone was in their place, that enslaved African Americans were contented, that no one felt the need to challenge these hierarchies, that no one resisted, that women were perfectly content with being part of the sort of larger patriarchal system. And now we know that's not true, right? We know the past was messy, but for Colonial Williamsburg's early visitors, who were largely white and largely wealthy, a narrative of the past where everything was happy and the wealthy white people sat at the top of the social pyramid and everything was happy and fine. That's what they wanted to see. And so that's what they got in the 1930s at Colonial Williamsburg. And so Helen Bullock is using recipes like Robert E. Lee cake to prop up that particular vision of the past, to make it part of, to build this imagined past for the wealthy white visitors to Colonial Williamsburg. And that's another kind of knowledge, right? This knowledge of a community's history, even if it's not necessarily accurate, it is still a particular kind of knowledge, this past interpretation. So to wrap up, today I've talked about a brief history of cookbooks in the English-speaking world, and then spent some time diving into what historians can learn from both print and manuscript cookbooks. Using cookbooks from the 17th, 18th, and 19th and 20th centuries, I talked about how cookbooks are an incredibly rich primary source for historians, particularly when it comes to thinking about knowledge. They show us different kinds of knowledge, from food knowledge to literacy, from knowledge about history and identity to knowledge about social circles, and how those knowledges were passed around communities. They also shine light on gender, race, and class dynamics in the past, and really, just are a wonderful, wonderful way for historians, for scholars, for anyone who's interested in the past to think critically about what it means to sit down and eat a meal, right? Looking at cookbooks, we understand that everything we eat is loaded, right? It's got meaning. It's got layers that we can unpack. And, unpacking these layers in these cookbooks is just the tip of the iceberg. So thank you all so much for your attention. I am happy to take any questions you might have, and I hope you can join us for the pop-up exhibit this afternoon.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marie. I'm clapping on behalf of our attendees today. Thank you for sharing your work and these wonderful images as well. Again, for our audience, if you have questions specific to the presentation or to this topic in general, feel free to use the Q&A function to share those with myself and Marie. So I just wanted to address the two that popped up while you were talking, Marie. From Kathy, is Mary Randolph of the Jefferson family?
Related, yes.
Related,
So
okay.
Mary Randolph is, oh gosh, it's one of those very complicated old Virginia family trees. She's related to the Jeffersons by marriage. Her brother, I believe, marries Jefferson's daughter, Martha. And Martha, so she's an in-law of the Jeffersons, and they're also cousins. I think her father, I think, is a cousin of Jefferson's, her father and Jefferson spent some time together as children. So yes, related, but sort of via marriage and as cousins, not directly.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. And also a really interesting comment here from Helen about the practicing of handwriting in cookbooks. That was fascinating, the way you see, just some, I don't know, practice happening.
Yeah.
And commenting here, I've also observed in window panes in houses where diamonds, presumably embedded in finger rings, are used to declare authenticity too. So this idea of, claiming space and also checking for authenticity and
yeah, that's
whether things work or not.
Yeah.
Yep,
that's absolutely fascinating. I know people also, people would use diamonds in their rings and like test them on the glass to see if the diamond was real, right?
Yeah.
Which is just, it's so cool when you see that I love that kind of material culture where you can see somebody's hand in the past, almost literally here, right? The hand of the past in the present. It's so fun.
Yeah. I think I've seen them at Bacon's Castle in particular, Shirley too, maybe Shirley Plantation and the James River. A really interesting question here about, have you ever read Cooking in Other Women's Kitchens? Have you looked into how these women came up with recipes, and how often do they cite how many of them came from enslaved women? And I think that's a really interesting question in terms of authorship and who's actually creating these recipes.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, I have read Cooking in Other Women's Kitchens. For those of you who maybe aren't as familiar with the book, it's about African-American domestic workers in the South from 1865 to, I believe it goes up to about 1960. And while that's not a topic of research that it's not the primary focus of my dissertation work, it is something I've thought a lot about, particularly in the context of Mary Randolph's book, The Virginia Housewife. Mary Randolph was a wealthy white Virginian woman. She was, even though she falls on hard times, and opens up a boarding house in order to keep her family financially stable, and then publishes this cookbook to keep her family financially stable. We know from census records that she owned enslaved people her entire life. And so while food historians from sort of the mid 20th century have been like, Mary Randolph must have been this amazing cook, we know from the census records that she owned enslaved people. We also know that cooking was a dirty, difficult, time-consuming thing to do. And so while Mary Randolph was certainly responsible for running her household, she was not doing day-to-day cooking all by herself. And so in the context of that 1824 cookbook, The Virginia Housewife, she does not cite enslaved women. She does not say anything. In fact, she doesn't use the word slave ever, anywhere. She talks about servants. She talks about how important it is to oversee your servants, she honestly sounds like she would have been a pain in the tush to work for, because she really sounds like her advice is basically micromanage, be observant, be present, and micromanage the heck out of your household staff. And we can tell from the recipes that it's not just Mary Randolph. Mary Randolph did not come up with all these recipes, right? There are recipes for things that have distinctly African influences, recipes for okra, for gumbo, for hot pot. There are also recipes with more distinctly Native American influence in the Virginia Housewife. So we can see, when we look really closely, we can see evidence of, enslaved women's knowledge in the pages of this text, but it's not acknowledged openly. We have to look really closely to find it. And what cooking in other women's kitchens does is it really unpacks the contributions of African-American women to Southern foodways, and notes and starts to trace, like, when do we start to see African-American women acknowledged in cookbooks, in Southern cookbooks published by white women? Not often. Really not all that often, even into the 20th century. And in fact, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you see Southern cookbooks that are acknowledging African-American presence by demeaning them, right? By associating certain foods with really harmful stereotypes about African-Americans. And so, there are a lot of layers to that question. I can keep going on, but it's an excellent book, and I would highly recommend it to anybody who's interested in some further reading.
Wonderful. So another question from Allison, who asks, is there a cookbook from the CW era, that's more accurate than that 1937 version? She mentions the name Eliza Smith.
Yeah. So that's another wonderful layered question. Allison, thank you for tapping directly into my dissertation topic. So accurate is an interesting word. There are plenty of cookbooks from colonial Williamsburg that offer historically inspired recipes that don't put forward the same narrative about sort of the lost cause and this conflation of the 18th and 19th centuries that I was talking about. Eliza Smith, the book that you're referencing there, that's a book from the 1740s. So the first English language cookbook published in British North America is printed in Williamsburg in 1742. It's a reprint of Eliza Smith's The Complete Housewife, which I think I showed a little bit earlier in the talk. That particular cookbook, I don't know if you can buy a facsimile of that, honestly. But I bet you probably can find a facsimile edition of it somewhere. And so that particular cookbook is a really great glimpse into what people were cooking and eating and thinking about their food in Williamsburg in the 1740s. So yes, definitely, if you are interested, I know that Special Collections at William and Mary has a copy of that 1742 cookbook, and anyone can go use Special Collections. So if you're able to get down to Williamsburg, and we are interested in seeing a copy of that book in person, they have one. Unfortunately, I do not have they're really rare. I think there's only like 6 or 7 copies of that 1742 cookbook that are like in circulation anywhere. So tragically, I do not have the 1742 Williamsburg edition of The Complete Housewife to share at the pop-up exhibit, but go check it out at Special Collections. Also, the folks down there are fantastic, and definitely worth getting to know.
Yeah. Allison also recommends the Catherine Harbury's Colonial Virginia's Cooking Dynasty as a really informative text, not just about the Randolph family, but early colonial foodways and customs. So
yes, the only thing I would say is read that book with a grain of salt, because Catherine Harbury, while she does some really incredible work about colonial foodways and customs is also generally just sort of elides the existence of enslaved people. And so read that book, but read it with a grain of salt.
And so just a comment from Barbara, thank you for these fascinating perspectives. I will now look for some of those aspects in the cookbooks I got from my mother. So I think it's really interesting, the personal connections and histories that pop up when we think about these broader conversations and the ways that these cookbooks preserve the past and our past too.
Thank you, Barbara.
Yeah. Quick, a question, maybe not quick, but Susie is asking, have you ever tried to make any of these historic recipes? If so, do you have a favorite?
You know, Susie, that's a great question. I did try as an undergraduate, and actually, I think there was a link put up in the chat to there's a website, More Than a KitchenAid, the Elizabeth Capel cookbook. That was my undergraduate senior thesis project. And for that project, I attempted to cook things from that 1699 cookbook. Now, I didn't know what I was doing, and it was a disaster. So if you'd like to see videos of, me 10 years ago trying to cook historic recipes in my dorm room kitchen, they're there. I think I can't say I have a favorite because they all turned out really badly and frankly kind of turned me off from attempting historic cooking. But perhaps my favorite catastrophe, I guess I'll put it this way. There was a recipe for pancakes, and I, was thought to myself, oh, pancakes aren't that hard. I'll be able to do pancakes. That's fine. So there was no baking powder or baking soda in 1699. Pancakes were leavened by whipping egg whites, like you would for a meringue, right? Whipping them until they're sort of stiff peaks and then folding that into the batter. I didn't know that because the recipe did not tell me, because I did not have the embodied knowledge that I was talking about. And so I just mixed the eggs in, and it called for a certain kind of wine that you definitely could not find in the Shaws. And it called for spices that I couldn't get. And long story short, these pancakes, think back to elementary school gym class when you put those rubber dots down on the floor to mark where the court started and ended, where the bases were for your wiffle ball game. That's what those tasted like, those rubber dots. It was like eating a rubber dot. So I am lucky in that my partner is a chemist. And so one day we keep joking that we're going to have a food history, food chemistry YouTube channel. And if we do, I'll let you guys know. And we can try some more historic recipes from a slightly more informed perspective.
That's wonderful. It makes me think about how many things are unavailable, that would have been maybe more easily on hand in the, 18th and 19th centuries.
Yeah. And just how different things are.
Yeah.
Pre-industrialization. The first one that comes to my mind is milk.
Yeah.
Right. Pasteurized milk versus unpasteurized, skim versus whole, and that whole thing. So yeah, thank you so much for that question. And it looks like someone in the Q&A has found a online version of Eliza Smith's book. The University of Michigan State has a really fantastic online cookbook library. So that might be another great resource if you're interested more in historic cookbooks. They also have a really phenomenal set of sort of interpretive essays that go with each of the cookbooks that they've digitized. I think it's called the Feeding America collection.
Yeah, so just a couple other, I think, cookbook that are available in digital spaces here too, that are coming up in the Q&A. And on that point, just as a way of closing and perhaps to link back to your work, your undergraduate work, which is quite impressive. How do you see digital, your work as a digital humanist? How do you see cookbooks and digital spaces as particularly complementary, or the digital space as a good platform for conversations about cookbooks?
Well, I think, first off, digital spaces allow us to have conversations like these, right? They allow us to gather from all different kinds of places, which I think is one of the things that I love about cookbooks, is that so often you're seeing the knowledge of lots of different people in one space. And I think that's really sort of complementary to digital spaces. And sort of, you think about like food blogs and stuff, you've got lots of people commenting and adding their, oh, well, I tried this and it didn't work, or this, this could be better, or I added this and it made it that much more delicious. And so I think that a lot of the interactions that we have in digital spaces about food really have parallels in the older cookbooks that I study and in the cookbooks that I've talked about. I also think, and this is a sort of shameless plug, if you go and sort of browse around that my undergraduate project, you'll notice that what I was able to do in the digital space was unpack all of these different layers of this cookbook, and give you a way as the user to interact with a 17th century manuscript, that you're probably not going to do a whole lot of interacting with 17th century manuscripts on a day-to-day basis, unless you happen to be an archivist or a historian. But what I was able to do was provide the entire text of the book. I was able to transcribe the entire text of the book so that you can see the page of the text itself and then the transcription. I built a visual dictionary that allows you to, when you come across a term that you might not know, it's hyperlinked to a visual dictionary, so you get a definition, but also an image, because some things are hard to imagine, right? We don't really use, one thing that came up over and over again was a tool called a chafing dish of coals. And I think a lot of us are probably familiar with chafing dishes, those sort of big rectangular things you see at banquets and whatever. And that technology didn't change much. It's just that we use sterno instead of like live fire. But I was able to assemble this visual dictionary to contextualize what I was doing and add the interpretive essays and those videos that I mentioned, to really make this book accessible to people in a way that if you went into the archives and said, I want to see this 17th century cookbook, my goal was to make it as accessible as possible to as wide a variety of people as possible. And I think that engaging with cookbooks and food in a digital space really enables us to do that, both when we're thinking about historical cookbooks and sort of cookbooks as primary sources, and also when we're thinking about food knowledge in our present day world.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so very much, Marie. I really appreciate all your expertise and the sharing of your research. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you again and learning more as your doctoral scholarship continues. And please, if you are in the Charlottesville area and able to, consider joining us for our on-site in-person pop-up exhibit, which will happen from 1 to 4 p.m. today. And you'll be able to see facsimiles of some of the recipe books that Marie was able to share with us today. So again, thank you so very much for your attendance today, and come see us at Highland.
Yes, please do. And if you have any further questions for me, you can email, I believe it's info@highland.org, or